Hey everybody, Nick Espinosa, your chief security fanatic here, and today we are doing breaches of the week. But as you can see on the screen here, this is not our normal breaches. I usually do these on Sundays. It is Monday, March 7th, and I'm doing that for context because this is a special Ukraine edition. If you follow me, if you've been on SoundCloud or YouTube or following me on any of my social media, you know I have been talking almost exclusively about Ukraine. I've got some great interviews with members of parliament, leaders of government, other people that are relevant to this entire situation. And so I wanted to go for breaches of the week. And this will resume on the normal breaches sooner than later here, but we are just all mired in this. It has been nonstop and quite frankly, depressing and tiring as well for anybody that is paying attention to this. But we want to dive in specifically to Ukraine because a lot of things are happening on the cybersecurity front. And I think this obviously should be, one, informing for everybody, but two, something that we all have to be aware of as Russia potentially turns to us. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's start real quick with everything that's been going on. And so this isn't just cyber attacks. We are talking about the sanctions and everything else that tech is doing to essentially fight Russia in their invasion of Ukraine, which the vast majority of the world is not on board with. We are against this. So with that, let's start here because internet-based sanctions have been basically brutal for the Russian economy. Now, consider some of these big points here that we are seeing that essentially the world is catching up with as the news is becoming fast and furious. And hopefully, you're up on this, but if not, you might be seeing this for the first time. But here's what's going on. If we are looking at this, essentially in the financial sector, major players like Visa, MasterCard, SWIFT, which is an international banking system, and more are cutting off either fully or partially Russia. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because we do the vast majority of our transactions now globally online. Banks are transferring money back and forth through the internet. We are just buying random crap wherever we're buying it from, using our credit cards, our Visa cards, our MasterCards. And so Visa, MasterCard, SWIFT, and other financial institutions have been cutting off Russia. By virtue of that, Russia has turned to China's Union Pay to actually replace Visa and MasterCard. So we're going to see how that plays out. Again, this is March 7 of 2022. So, we've got a long way to go, I think, in this war, but that is on the financial sector. Now, if we're looking at this, major streaming platforms like Netflix, YouTube, Warner Brothers for movie distribution, as well as Sony and Disney as well, have said that they are either canceling their streaming or won't play the latest releases in Russia, all those kinds of things. They are essentially cutting Russia off. And because Warner Brothers, Sony, and Disney are now cross making their movies basically physically in theaters as well as streaming, they get added to the big tech and internet response as well. And that's a huge thing. If you're looking at this social media, and surprisingly enough to me, TikTok has vastly reduced Russia's access, even though they are based in China. And China has been really sitting on the fence with this. Obviously, Russia's going to Union Pay, so China's got this mixed message here. But TikTok is cutting them off. Facebook is shutting them down. Twitter is partially shutting them down, and other major social media platforms as well. And so we'll see what happens. We're going to keep monitoring this, but social media, obviously there's a million different platforms, but some of the big ones out there are really shutting them down. And if you're looking at big tech as a whole, here's just a smattering of some of the massive multi-billion-dollar tech corporations that are essentially cutting off Russia, either from buying equipment, using their services online, or other things. This is a huge, massive blow to Russia. And if you think about it, everything we do is essentially online at this point. We are all interconnected in these various ways, even our cars. So this is a huge thing that is essentially happening. And these sanctions have had a serious impact on the Russian economy, not to mention other sanctions outside of big tech, like massive sports organizations like FIFA, which is the governing body of soccer around the globe, has cut them off from things like the World Cup and competitions, as well as other governing bodies around the globe. So this is a huge thing. And we're not alone in this in the sense of sanctions, because internet cyber attacks against Russia have been fast and furious, not necessarily from governments and intelligence agencies, especially around NATO, as they sit back and watch, but hacking collectives, criminal gangs, those kinds of things have really taken Russia to task. So for example, Anonymous the hacking collective has claimed basically attacks against Russian TV. In other words, what we have seen and what we've reported on and what I've actually talked about live in interviews with members of parliament, you can go see those on my YouTube channel or SoundCloud or anyone on my social media if you follow me. They basically have claimed that they have knocked out Russian television and replaced the programming with pro-Ukraine things like flying the Ukraine flag, doing singing the national anthem of Ukraine, those kinds of things. That is essentially what we're talking about. In my interviews with members of parliament, they also requested that Anonymous start putting up the body count that the Ukrainian defense forces are inflicting upon the incoming Russian troops so that the mothers and fathers of Russia understand this as well. But Anonymous claims this. Also, Anonymous claimed to hit Russian-based streaming services such as Wink and Ivy. I'm not 100% sure if they're based in Russia, but they are attacking that infrastructure, essentially knocking out streaming services. And from what I understand from Ivy, it's essentially the Russian version of Netflix as well. And so that is essentially huge. But the cyber attacks aren't necessarily completely against the Russian people when they're watching TV or streaming whatever they want to stream. We are hitting spy satellites. So Network Brigade 65 or NB65, which apparently is an affiliate of Anonymous, is claiming to have found a way into Russian spy satellites. Obviously, those are the satellites that would be help coordinating troop movements on the ground, and say that they have been knocking those out, changing logins, all these kinds of things to make it that much more difficult for the Russian military and intelligence services to actually operate. I don't think Russia was seeing that, but this really goes back to the 5 laws of cybersecurity. If there's a vulnerability, it will be exploited, and everything is vulnerable in some way. And Russia is getting a real lesson in the 5 laws of cybersecurity right now. And also, Anonymous and multiple other groups have claimed to be hitting with denial of service attacks and other types of attacks Russian websites. These are the government websites like the Kremlin, which is the governing body of Russia, and others as well. So we are seeing cyber attacks across the board. This is coming fast and furious. I am trying to keep up with this over the week. And those that follow me know I have been doing nothing but keeping up with this, not just for my public social media or the interviews or my nationally syndicated radio show, but also for my clients that have interests in country in Ukraine as well, which obviously is a huge, huge thing. And also for the record, Russia has been they've been very busy themselves just hitting everybody else. So think about this. Ukrainian websites, per all reports, have been under constant attack. And leading up to essentially the actual physical kinetic invasion where they sent troops across the border, there were multiple cyber attacks against Ukraine, against their banking and financial system, against their government infrastructure. The belief was that essentially the Russians were trying to disillusion the Ukrainian population against the government, meaning if you can't access your money from an ATM or you can't access other government services, you start to lose faith in your government, and therefore you may welcome the Russian invaders that will help stabilize this. Although it seems that Ukraine did a very good job of informing their public, it's not the government, it's the Russians. Prepare for attack, because here we are, over 100,000, according to my last interview with one of their members of parliament, over 100,000 Ukrainians have actually signed up for 1-year conscription and service for Ukrainian defense forces to essentially repel the Russian invaders. So that's obviously a huge thing, but this isn't the only thing that Russia is doing, because they've been hitting organizations outside of Ukraine, and instead of out, I should say outside of Ukraine, and they are claiming to be hit. I did an interview essentially with the president of the Ukraine American Congress Committee, or Committee Congress, of America, the Illinois division of it. He's actually here in Chicago. And he said in the interview that he had actually been attacked, that his computers had been infected. And what better target to hit as opposed to governments like the United States or Germany or any other NATO ally? Why not hit Ukrainian organizations? Because those Ukrainian organizations that are outside of Ukraine are going to have Ukrainians working for them and essentially making those organizations work, which means they have a vested interest in their relatives back home, their siblings, their parents, their children, their cousins, whoever it is. And so why not hit them and cripple them abroad to attempt to demoralize? And so we are seeing reports of Ukrainian organizations abroad being hit by Russia as well. We're also seeing disinformation campaigns rampant throughout Ukraine. And a lot of cybersecurity research organizations and threat intelligence are saying that the vast majority of Russian-focused cyber attacks are happening in Ukraine right now. This is there essentially to aid the troops. But the one thing that Russia's not doing that we've seen is knocking out the actual infrastructure. I interviewed Dale Buckner, who is the CEO and founder of Global Guardian, last week. They have assets actually in Ukraine helping exfiltrate people from Ukraine. And he mentioned that essentially Intel is reporting that the Russians need Ukrainian internet too. This means that there's a double-edged sword, that the Ukrainians get to use their internet while the Russians get to use their internet, so the Russians can't knock it out, which means the Ukrainians actually get to use it, and we are witnessing a social media war. But by virtue of that, the Russians are also running disinformation campaigns. One of the most notable ones is against President Zelensky, who has essentially said he would not leave Kyiv, he would not leave Ukraine. He is basically fighting to the death to save his country, and the Russians dumped on their social media, on their local social media in Ukraine, that essentially Zelensky had fled the country. I believe it was to Poland, and therefore all troops should give up, because if he gave up, everybody should give up. And Zelensky himself, the president, had to come out and say, I am here, I'm in Kyiv, I'm staying. So this is a constant battle that we are seeing. And understand that Ukraine is the size of Texas, with the population of California. There are a huge amount of places in Ukraine that are not under Russian attack, because 150 to 200,000 Russian troops in a population that size, in a land size that size, is not enough to occupy. So they have to run disinformation campaigns as they're attempting to take over the major cities, all of them of which, quite frankly, are still standing as I'm talking to you here on March 7th. If I'm wrong, and I hope I'm not, here we are. But Kyiv, Kharkiv, and others are still standing. On top of that, Russia is also weighing cyber attacks against the West, and we're going to see what happens there. Again, on March 7th, we haven't seen anything major as I'm talking to you here in the evening in Chicago around 6 p.m. Central Time, and we'll see what happens there. But as Russia gets more desperate, as essentially this war gets prolonged in a way, I quite frankly, and many intelligence agree, that they didn't think was going to be prolonged like this, as well as all of these economic sanctions, both by big tech, financial institutions, sporting institutions, streaming services, you take it, they are starting to feel the pain. And they're not going to go ahead and attempt a land invasion of the United States or any NATO ally, because NATO allies, including the United States, are more populous, we're better equipped, we have more modern armies. Reports have shown that they have been essentially bringing in anti-aircraft weaponry into Ukraine that is decades old at this point. So they were not expecting this. So that's a huge, huge problem for them. So their only retaliation may possibly be launching cyber attacks against us. And that is something I think we all need to be aware of. And so I've got an article that I'm hoping is going to be published sooner than later on those steps that everybody can take, from the individual to businesses, on essentially what to expect in a cyber attack. One of the problems that we have here in the United States, and I would assume many other countries that are allies of us, is simply that we take for granted that the internet essentially connects us to absolutely everything, whether we are, calling in 911 centers that are using voice over IP systems, whether we're getting, gas at the pumps. And I understand 911 is more harder than that, but imagine knocking that out, to traffic centralization management systems for stoplights and other things. We are so interconnected here, not to mention electricity, water and wastewater and everything else, that we really need to be preparing for this eventuality. And if Russia gets more desperate, this is what we're going to see. So I want to make sure that everybody is prepared for this. I want to make sure that everybody understands that we should essentially be looking at this, but we are launching, or rather, I should say, individuals or collectives are launching cyber attacks at Russia. If they hit us, the intelligence communities, I think, are essentially going to shut them down. The other rumor is that Russia is looking at cutting themselves off of the internet. They did a dry run of that in 2021, and intelligence estimates put that at March 11 of this year, obviously, if they're going to cut themselves off, which means it'll be much harder to launch cyber attacks. But that doesn't mean they don't have assets out of country in other countries using their infrastructure to launch attacks against us. Why not pick up the Internet Research Agency and move it out of country somewhere else? And until it's caught, it can continue to do its work against basically all NATO allies, including the United States. So these are things that we need to talk about. These are things that we need to be aware of. And these are things that are part of this week's special Ukraine edition of Breaches of the Week. You can't say you haven't been told. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, if you're in Ukraine, survive. Thank you.